Hello and welcome. We have with us today Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who probably needs no introduction in any case. He's the Vice Chairman of the Kerala Planning Board and also has been teaching in Jawaharlal Nehru University for quite some time. Prabhat, welcome.
Thank you.
Of course, as any economist, you would be really asked now about the global economic crisis. I'm sure that you've been asked about this enough number of times already. But just for our listeners or our viewers, what would you characterize as the main elements of the global economic crisis today?
Well, the main elements begin, of course, with the global financial crisis, and that's for reasons which are very well known. You have the housing bubble which collapses, and that gives rise to the financial crisis. But subsequent to the financial crisis, there has been a very serious recession, particularly in the United States, where unemployment now has crossed 9.5%, and in Britain and generally in continental Europe as well. The remarkable thing is that this is a crisis which has actually hit the centers of capitalism, and whatever impact is felt in the periphery is something which is spreading from the center to this periphery, the peripheral countries.
Would you also look at this that it started with the housing crisis in the United States, the mortgage crisis and so on. The US in that sense has been able to pass off a part of the burden to other countries and other financial institutions around the world.
You see, at the present moment, finance is globalized. Therefore, a lot of financial institutions in Europe, in Britain, already were a part of the various bubbles. I mean, prior to the housing bubble, there was a dot-com bubble. So they have been, as a part of this globalization process, very much included in the US financial scene. So when the crash comes, it affects all of them. We in India got away easily because our banks are not still allowed to hold very substantial amounts of foreign assets.
The interesting part of it, particularly you raised the dot-com bubble, and that is also a real estate bubble, except that's in virtual space, but that's really a real estate bubble again. The interesting part of this is that the financial sector seems to require bubbles continuously. Do you think that's intrinsic to the nature of the capitalist economy?
Yes, in fact, I really believe that if you look at modern capitalism, by which I mean capitalism in the period after asset markets, especially financial asset markets, have got established, modern capitalism is one where growth is essentially fed by bubbles. I'm not saying bubbles alone feed growth, but I think whatever be the underlying factor behind the growth, there is, as it were, a superimposition of bubbles upon them, which is very much a part of the boom. But when that boom bursts, there is a collapse. I think if you look at this entire period, let's say roughly from the end of the 19th century till now, you see in periods when there is an underlying upward trend, whether you have bubbles which get built up and collapse or not, the crises are relatively short-lived and shallow because there is an underlying trend that helps you overcome the period of crisis relatively faster. But if you have this bubbles fed growth being superimposed on a situation where the underlying trend is absent for whatever reason, then you have the severe crisis in capitalism. 1930s was one of them, and I am of the view that the current crisis is the other one. The 1930s crisis was one where the underlying trend had disappeared because that entire colonial arrangement, the triangular arrangement of Britain's trade with colonies financing Britain's capital exports to the New World, that entire arrangement which fed the long boom right until the First World War had come to an end. The current period of crisis is because I think the state-led growth process based on Keynesian demand management is now on the retreat. When you have a bubble superimposed on top of this, when the basic growth factor is weakening anyway, you have much more protracted crisis.
You have argued that essentially, if this bubble had not been created, in some sense this crisis would have come earlier. In that sense, it has intensified an existing situation that existed, but it is not the cause of the crisis.
No, you see, bursting of bubbles is inevitable, and any bursting of the bubble would give rise to a crisis. But how deep, prolonged and protracted the crisis is would depend upon whether you can ride it out because there is an underlying growth momentum for some other reasons, non-bubble reasons. But in a period when the underlying growth momentum is weak, then these crises can be fairly long and protracted.
Some of the economists, good Keynesian types, have also argued that essentially it's a problem of the financial sector having gone haywire and not really addressing the issue of the underlying economy. Would you have some comments on that?
No, you know, what they miss is the following, that suppose, or you know, many of them who are actually saying that the problem is that finance was not regulated. You see, that the bubble gets built up, and when it gets built up, it has genuine effects in terms of employment, in terms of output and so on. And when it collapses, you have a severe slump. So if you say that we must prevent the slump, in that case, you also have to take measures that would also mean that the boom is truncated. So to imagine that the bursting of the bubble is bad, but the formation of the bubble is good, is a pointless exercise, because one can't happen without the other.
I think we'll come back in the next section to a more detailed analysis of this bubble phenomenon.